part 2. Apologies for the wait. If you missed part 1, it will be linked up in the corner or down in the description. Whoa. Just like the first part, I will keep this intro short and come back at the end for some kind of summary or something like that. So let's just continue on with the build. So the next thing I will tackle here is bleeding the brakes. The reason being, I would like to make sure everything is tight and no leakage before I start messing around with pressing in bottom brackets and such. So we'll start by inserting the bleed block in the caliper and removing the bleed screw from the shift lever or the brake lever. Now we'll put on the bleed funnel adapter and then the bleed funnel. I will also adjust the bars to have the bleed funnel nice and leveled. A good tip is to have some rubber gloves and some paper towels prepared, because there's always a risk of stuff being a bit messy when you start messing around with mineral oil. So with a completely dry system, I have found that it's always best to try and push in the brake fluid, or in this case mineral oil, from the bottom up to the shift lever. So I will pull some brake fluid into the syringe, and then before I connect this to the caliper, I will make sure to push out all the air from the syringe, just to make sure you don't introduce any unnecessary air you then need to remove from the system. So then I will connect the syringe into the bleed port on the caliper, open the bleed port with a 7mm spanner, and then slowly push in the fluid until I can see it coming up through the bleed funnel. And just to be safe, I will make sure I have at least around half of this funnel full before I disconnect the syringe. Any brake fluid or mineral oil I have left in the syringe, I can put back in the bottle and reuse later. I would not, however, reuse anything that has been pushed through the system. So everything up at the funnel, I will just throw away, as it can contain contaminants and other stuff you don't want to mix with fresh new brake fluid. So then I will just squeeze the shift lever and try to get out all the air, and you probably see a bunch of air bubbles coming out. Tapping the hoses and tipping the frame back and forth also works pretty good to free those air bubbles that could be trapped inside the system. I also use the normal way of bleeding the brakes, which is to take that rubber hose, secure a plastic bag to the hose or something else to collect any eventual brake fluid. And then I connected the hose to the caliper and made sure I had enough fluid in the bleed funnel at the top. I placed my 7mm spanner on the bleed nut so that I could easily open and close the bleed nut with one hand. Then with the other hand, I squeezed the brake lever, and at the same time I opened the bleed nut on the caliper. As soon as the brake lever bottomed out against the handlebar, I closed the bleed nut and released the lever. Then I start to pump the lever again, and I can feel the pressure building up, and hopefully those last stubborn air bubbles would escape. In this particular case, it didn't do much actually. Most of the air already seemed to have escaped, but in the past I had to do this several times before the lever firmed up enough and all the air stopped coming out. This method is what I use when bleeding the brakes mid-season, when you already have fluid in the system. So you don't need to use the syringe, just do a normal bleed, so to speak. As I was happy with my bleed, I made sure the bleed nuts were closed, put the stopper in the bleed funnel, then remove the funnel from the funnel adapter. And like I said, I will not reuse this fluid and just throw it away. Then I removed the bleed funnel adapter, and I put the bleed screw back into the lever before I wipe the fluid off to make sure air doesn't get into the lever. Be careful here not to tighten the screw too tight, as it's super easy to strip. And if you search on weight weanings, for example, there's a lot of people, including me, that have made the mistake of tightening this screw too much. So be careful about that. Then I will just use some paper towels and some degreaser to wipe the lever clean of any excess brake fluid. Same down at the caliper. Make sure you don't have any brake fluid around there to contaminate your brake pads. And that's the front brake done. So to finish off the bleeding part here, I will just leave the time lapse of me doing the rear brake to show the complete process. Apologies for the flickering lights. I will say though a few tips. Once the air bubbles has stopped coming out to the bleed funnel when you're squeezing the lever, etc., I usually take a 10 to 15 minute break, let it set in, then do a last round of pumping the lever, tilting the frame, just to make 100% sure I got as much of the air as possible out of the system. This time it's worked out well, but in the past, if I had trouble getting all the air out of the system, especially the rear brake with its longer hose, I experienced the lever actually became squishy after a few rides, especially when you compare it to the front lever. What I did then is just use the funnel bleeding method, just attach the funnel, put in some brake fluid and squeeze the brake lever a couple of times to get all those last couple of bubbles out. The lever firmed up pretty quickly and I was back to the same firm feeling as my front brake. If you experience that, that's a quick and easy fix. You don't need to mess around with syringes or anything, so don't be afraid to do an extra bleed here and there if you feel your levers becoming a bit skabushki. There we go. Both levers nice and firm. So next I will take care of the bottom bracket, but before I start pressing in cups in the frame, I wanted to make sure I didn't have any rattling inside the frame. So I just put the wheels on and bounced the frame. I tried to listen for any weird sound that could potentially annoy me out on the roads. As this is a press fit frame, it's not an easy job to take the BB out just to fix a rattling Di2 cable, for example. Once I was sure I didn't hear any weird rattling noises, I prepped the BB shell with some degreaser and a paper towel to make sure all the surfaces were nice and clean. I used this universal bottom bracket press to press the BB cups in. I just needed to make sure I had the right side of the bearing drifts. In this case it's the 30mm side, as this is a BB 386 bottom bracket. Then I prepped both the BB shell and the bearing cup with this brake protector from Wakos. This stuff is legendary here in Japan as the ultimate BB creak killer, and like I mentioned in a couple of videos where I used this before, it's very hard to find outside of Japan, unfortunately. I did, however, find one online store that ships worldwide and is in English. So depending on when you watch this, check the description, and if there's a link for this Wakos brake protector, you should be able to find it there. It's not cheap, but like I mentioned in previous videos, I haven't had a single creaking bottom bracket when using this stuff, so I will definitely vouch for it. I hope it's still available from that online store when you watch this video. So like I said, I will put a thin layer of this both in the bottom bracket shell and around the bottom bracket cups. If you use this stuff, be really careful not to get this on the actual bearing. I can imagine it would be borderline impossible to clean that up later, so be careful with that. Then I took both cups and aligned them in the bottom bracket shell, tried to get them square on, put on the press tool with the bearing drifts on both sides. For this tool I used an adjustable wrench on one side and an 8mm hex key to press both cups at the same time. Unfortunately, this video recording cut out mid-press. I don't really know what happened there, and that was a bummer. I really wanted to see if I made a mistake here. If you've seen the video from the first ride back on the bike, I mentioned there that the BB had a lot of drag to it. When I spun the crank, it didn't spin more than a revolution really. They turned smoothly though, there were no unevenness or weird noises, but the feeling was like they had been stuffed with too much grease. I didn't really inspect the BB bearings before pressing them in. That was probably my first mistake. My thinking is that I pressed the cups too tight and put too much pressure on the bearings. I couldn't feel the drag while riding or anything, so it wasn't anything crazy. And after the first ride I took the chain off and spun the cranks, and the drag had decreased a lot. Not quite to the level of my previous ceramic bearings, but nothing that would bother my OCD anymore. So I think I managed to avoid any immediate damage. In worst case, these BB might wear a bit faster than normal, but it's not the end of the world. It's definitely a reminder of how careful you need to be when pressing in bearings and bearing cups. I've been lucky not to have had any problems like these up until now, but you live and you learn, like they said. I'm an amateur mechanic after all. I definitely think I will look into those thread together bottom bracket solutions for the next installation though. Anyway, back to the build. After the cups were in the frame, I carefully cleaned off any brake protector around the bottom bracket shell, as this is super sticky. The last thing you want is to get this stuff on your bearings, so careful with that. Then it was time to get those beautiful cranks in place. I put a layer of grease on both the bearings and the crank spindle. I put on the bearing dust cover on the spindle for the non-drive side. I probably should have put on the dust cover before the grease in hindsight, but there you go. Then I use a rubber mallet to gently tap the crank into the frame. After that, I put some more grease on the splines on the drive side and put on the bearing dust cover, then the drive side crank arm with a chainring in place. If you're interested in knowing how to install chain rings on these Easton EC90SL cranks, check my previous video where I did a full unboxing and a proper installation of the chain ring. Then I tightened down the crank with an 8mm hex key and finished off by torquing down the crank with my big torque wrench down to 50 Nm. To preload the bottom bracket bearings, I made sure the drive side was pushed as far in as possible towards the frame. Then I turned the preload collar or lock ring on the non-drive side just hand tight against the BB and made sure it didn't have any play in the crank. I used a 2mm Allen key to lock the ring in place, just enough to close the gap in the ring. If you over tighten it, it could damage the lock ring, they say, so be careful there. To cut the new chain to length, I simply used my old chain as a reference. I hung both chains from a small hex key and I could easily see where I needed to cut the chain. The new chain came with a quick link though, so I needed to take that into account as well. As you can see, when running a 1x with a 42 chainring and a chain that should be long enough for a 46 tooth cog in the back, I only needed to remove one chain link set or one inner and outer link from this 116 link chain. Of course, this could differ a lot depending on how long chain stays you have, so there's no one length to fit all chainring cassette combinations, unfortunately. So when the chain was cut, I threaded the chain around the chainring and through the rear mech and connected the ends with the quick link. To lock the quick link in place without the quick link tool or needle nose pliers, I put the rear wheel on, made sure I had the link between the cassette and the chainring above the chainstay, and then I just gently pushed the crank arm with my foot until I could hear that lock ring pop into its locked position. And that's it. To finish this part off, I will just put on the beautiful Berk Lupina saddle. This is mostly just mentally to make this look like a bike. I will finalize the actual saddle position a bit later on in the build. So regarding that crank, I have about 450 Ks now without any issues. I haven't had to readjust anything for the preload or anything like that, and no weird noises. And that drag I had in the bearing after the build basically went away after the first ride. So I think I'm in the clear, but if something happens along the way, I'll be sure to report back about that. So if I calculated this correct, I should be able to finish the build in the next video. If you found this part interesting or helpful in any way, feel free to leave a like. Always appreciated. And subscribe for the next and hopefully final part. And I will catch you in the next one. Peace!